Thank you, and thanks to Bartlett Trees for having me, and thank you, Kenan, for all the work you did to find me. And it's really great to be here. Some of you have probably heard me talk on Vimeo, and those are what they are. But in one of those talks, I mentioned how landscape architects really are the hope of any kind of a sustainable future. And that's absolutely how I live, and that's how I want you to understand you're valued, because we are not linear thinkers. And the quote was that the product of linear thinking is efficiency over efficacy. And I know a lot of people struggle with that, but that's a real simple truth. And if you ever look at the curriculum of any engineering program, and I've looked at a lot of them, it's linear thought. We are not linear thinkers. And if somebody is drawn to engineering, even though I've been accused of being an engineer a lot because I work with water, the last thing a landscape architect is a linear thinker. We're systems thinkers. We're effective managers of space. If you pick the perfect tree from Bartlett, you want to make sure that it gets watered, that it's got the right environment for the roots, that the soil is right, that the sun is right, and that it's got the right amount of wind exposure. Because if you don't, that tree's never going to be what it could be. That's systems thinking. So when we talk about managing water, it's second nature for us, but we've given that away too many times to other professions, and other professions have been very effective at mining that. And so the reality is, I think a landscape architect should be on every team that manages water. In fact, I'll go even one step further. Landscape architects should be the lead designer on every team that manages water, because we're the folks that help them from getting in trouble. We don't let them design the perfect catch basin, the precisely designed pipe, and then this wonderful pond at the end of it that stores all this fetid water very efficiently. But what happened to all the sediment? What happened to all of the other things that could have happened with that water? And so where this talk is really going to go is this, distill all that down to the simple fact that we are running out of potable water. We are running out of potable water. Now, I've been often accused, I grew up in the West, and so one of the things that happens is I tell all the students when they first meet me that sometimes if you don't understand what I'm saying, just keep listening, because it's my Western accident, and an accident's what happens when the English language impacts somebody from the Southwest. So what I often do is I get kind of lazy in some of my speech, and I don't add that word potable, and I'll say we're running out of water. And I gave a presentation to the AIA about a year ago, and a guy asked this question in the back. He said, you know, last time I checked, it's a balance. And there is no new water. Well, actually, there's a little new water, but there's no new water. He said, and I realized it was my error. I said, you're absolutely right. It's my fault. What the word is the qualifier is potable water, because that balance purifies water that's impure to get it back to the level of potability. But because of changes in the environment, because of changes in the built environment, it is being obviated from doing that. There's no longer that opportunity for the purification that needs to happen to make water potable. And I look at hydrographs all the time for watersheds. In fact, and we'll see a slide here in a little bit, on the 23rd of January this year, I was one of the group from ILASLA who was very pleased to be invited by the White House to speak to the President's Blue Ribbon Commission on Environmental Resilience. And that was a great experience. That was an e-ticket. It was so much fun to sit at that table and to speak to those people who wanted to hear what we had to say. And they gave us a report. I don't remember how big it was, but it was a good report. And I must have read that report 900 times. Well, I at least read it 300 times, because I know I kept warding out my comments in the margins, and it got to the point they had to make a couple more copies, and those got so filled that at 3:30 the morning before our meeting, I was going back and revising my revisions for questions that I wanted to ask and comments and observations. And when I spoke to that commission, I had to admire them, and I gave them this credit. I said, you know, I read this report so many times that I realized this is beautifully written. It's got 1 foot squarely in political science, which I know nothing about. Even though I worked for 11 years, I'm the author of the Practice Act in Wisconsin. It took 11 years to get through. You think I'd have learned something about politics? No politics. But the other foot is in the science that we understand, talking about volumes and quantities and potability of water and uses of water. And so I told them I admired the report for what it did. But I could see by reading between all of this other political science stuff that would not allow them to say it, that we are running out of potable water, and they recognize it in this report. security. People are now talking about food security in cities. That's great. We'll die before we ever get hungry if we don't have water. And the simple truth is, we've got to do something aggressive about it. So every year, ILASLA sends us to they send your leaders to the lobby day in the spring. And I've been lucky enough to do that, I think, for 16 years. And every year they give the same lecture. Don't talk about climate change because it's political. I have no problem with that. So I walk into the senator's, the assembly person's office, and I say, I don't care what you call it. The science, the everyday reality that I deal with as a landscape architect is that we're running out of water. We're running out of potable water, but it's what we can do about that. And I talk about storm events, how rapidly they're occurring. You all know that the 100-year storm event is not what it used to be. In fact, that's somewhere around the 27-year storm event now. The one that we probably grew up with comfortably is the 100-year event. I saw a really disquieting research the other day that talked about how they compared the environment to the model of an engine and how you create this energy that does work in an engine like that. And based on that model, because of these incredibly intense and frequent events that are occurring now with stormwater, there may not be enough energy to support those wonderful Midwestern storms that you all remember when you were about 6, that seemed to go to the center of the earth and the world shook and the sky turned darker than the inside of a cow and you knew you were in for some rain. Well, we're not going to see as many of those anymore because it's being taken over by this change. And I don't care, they can talk about it's because we drive cars. Absolutely. Those are all things that I can't control. But as a landscape architect, I have to think about what we can do with this water. So that goes back to that systems thinking thing, right? We're systems thinkers. So when an architect or an engineer wants to create a catch basin, a perfectly designed pipe using the Manning equation, and then the right size basin at the end of it, I ask the simple questions about where else can we put that water? How can we stage it in little pockets down the slope so that it all doesn't go to the bottom of the slope at the same time? You'll get an engineer's attention with that one because they think, oh, now I can design that pipe a little differently and save them a couple bucks. Well, pennies anyway. Engineers love that. So you can talk to them about that stuff. Say, well, what if we put some of that water here? What if we broke it up? What if we put a green roof somewhere? What if we had some sort of delaying device that could stage that water into different pockets? And where that thinking goes is, it will not be that long before in every one of our plans we have to create cisterns to capture water that we can purify to potability. It is that simple. So when you're starting to think about water systems that not only capture water for taking a branch off of your water catchment system that now waters the orchard, or takes some of the other water over to permaculture, or takes some water to do different things, we're going to have to start thinking about why don't we flush our toilets with stormwater? They've been doing it in Europe for a long time. And last time I checked, nobody's dead because they flushed their toilet with stormwater. You know, does that make sense when we're running out of potable water to use that same precious water? No, it doesn't. Here's another one. This room, this building, the mechanicals on the roof are cooled with potable water. Because in whether it's heating or cooling, it generates heat. And so there's a water jacket, just like your radiator in your car, that passes water by it to cool it down so it now can be a more efficient engine. Engineers love it, right? Now, the only change in the water between the beginning and the end of this sequence is the heat goes up. So now what was cool potable water is now warm potable water. But every code that I've dealt with in the United States now calls that sewage. It has to be now mixed in with black water and goes to a waste treatment device. Does that make sense? Why don't we use another pocket of that stormwater system to capture some water and now put that into another purification system, and even taking out some of the fines is all that needs. It doesn't have to be potable, and now it can go through and cool the building. But if, rather than throw it away, why don't we recycle it? Maybe one photovoltaic panel to drive a photo pump, and you can recycle that water. And I'll show you a project later in this that I did. It's part of that 138-acre project that was mentioned at the beginning, where I used that same water. Nothing cools water as effectively as a vertical drop. So you create a waterfall with that same water, or a fountain. Now that water that was warm water now becomes cooler water. You also get more sediment out, and now you can recycle that with a photo pump that will come back into the system at really no net negative for our water table. And eventually it can be released back into recharge. Here's another one that really frosts my glass. Does everybody here know where their sewer treatment plant is? Is it in the same watershed that the water is mined from? More often than not, it's in somebody else's watershed. So once again, we're in a net export condition. Does that make sense? I don't think so, especially with a water freak like me. I found out that my watershed is actually, our water that we're mining is going over back into the Mississippi River. And that's great for New Orleans, but it really sucks for Wisconsin, because that water is critical. But we're in a net export condition. So that's one of the things that makes me kind of crazy. Can you go back again? I don't remember if I hit all those points. I don't use PowerPoints at all. And I know that Ilona and Danielle are probably laughing like crazy. No, you don't do PowerPoints. I don't do PowerPoints. But I thought this would be more user-friendly so you guys could read stuff, and this way I can make sure you didn't miss anything. Okay, so health, safety, and welfare, right? Our jobs are centered on health, safety, and welfare. That's why we have the licenses, the numbers, the stamps. So once you know that we're running out of potable water, if you're going to take care of the HSW of your clients, can we ever again talk to a client without mentioning that? That's something we do. It's value added. Turn that into money in our pockets and say, yes, we do that. We do water systems design. And you can hire all the engineers you want to crunch the numbers if you're not comfortable doing that. But your value is thinking systematically. And you got that back in school. You probably came to school with that. You didn't get it in school. Maybe they nurtured it a little bit, but it was already in you. That kind of sensibility is where landscape architects live. That notion that we can make these differences in lots of systems, because we're juggling all those all the time. So again, health, safety, and welfare. So every time I visit with a client, you can bet that that's our first part of our first discussion. And I will tell them that we are running out of potable water, but we can make a difference on their project, whether it's a residential project, a commercial project, or a municipal project. Now, one of the interesting things about the discussion with the White House committee or council was that they had already, in the last part of that document, there is a mandate that public facilities start to do some of the things they talk about in that report. So we're going to start to see water harvesting in this last end of this current regime. This current management system is going to mandate that government buildings start to do water harvesting, that they start to think about alternative sources for water in buildings, that they start to do some of that stuff. So we're at the leading edge of that. We need to be thinking that way. You already are. I can see the wheels turning. I love this. This is so fun. Now, one of the things I want to introduce is please don't feel constrained. If you want to ask a question in the process, don't worry about asking it later, because I think we all learn from questions. So if you think, well, what are you talking about? Ask me, please, because I love that. That's landscape architects. I'm talking to the choir. You guys know that's where we make our money. We can't tell everybody the reason we did all these things. We'd bore them to death. My wife bought me a t-shirt that said, I'm a landscape architect. I solve problems you never knew you had in ways you'll never understand. So I understand that. We all do that. So please, if you have a question, don't hesitate to ask. So again, that's the first question I think we should always ask. This problem is not just in some of the places you think of. Like we hear about the California drought and how in trouble they are. But it is bigger than that. In fact, it is places that you wouldn't normally assume it is. And we'll talk about some of these later, but it is Wisconsin. I mean, I know people in Wisconsin that are absolutely still mad at Minnesota for putting on their license plates land of 10,000 lakes, because there are more than 10,000 lakes in Wisconsin. But potability is the issue. I work a lot with First Nations up in the northern part of the state, the Ojibwa, the Menominee. And I've been on many Ojibwa reservations when the fishery guy comes into the meeting and says, I've got to be gone because I have to go visit the remote locations on our res and tell the people not to eat the fish because they're hyperaccumulators and there's bad stuff in that fish. That's northern Wisconsin where the trees are tall. You know the story, you've been there. That's not pure water anymore. In fact, never, ever again capture that first snowflake on your tongue. Do not do that. It used to be something we all thought was kind of cool when you were kids. Don't let them do it. Because there's more stuff in that snowflake than I don't even want to tell you about. But it's something you need to understand. That's the environment in which we live. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about this aquifer thing. And one of the wonderful things about talking to landscape architects is you all understand what an aquifer is. You know, it's that great underground pure water that exists. And this is true. There are maps. This is a map of some of the major aquifers in the United States. The Oglalla is the one that probably gets the most attention. It's also called the High Plains Aquifer. Can everybody kind of see that, where that is? That's a big one, right? Well, I bumped into some research a couple years ago that talked about how the Oglalla will be dry in 50 years. That's not true. because that assumption was made based on current rates of drawdown. The fact of the matter is, it will be less than 50 years because the current rate is no longer current. They're taking every drop of water they can get before their neighbor gets it first. So there's a race to use the Oglalla. So it will definitely be within 50 years. And if you can go to the next slide, please, Kenneth. Some of the facts about the Oglalla make you realize how huge that aquifer is and what an amazing impact it has on the United States economy. Now, one of the scary things about teaching at university is I get to talk to a lot of people and I get to bump into a lot of research. And a few days back, well, actually it was about 3 months ago, I was talking to a grad student, PhD student in agriculture who was doing some work in our department. And she has a farm in southern Wisconsin. And we were talking about how we could remediate the agricultural waste off of her fairly concentrated farm animals into the environment so it wouldn't be a negative recharge event, that we could get that stretched out and do some phytoremediation, some things could happen. And I got on this tangent, as Danielle and Ilona know I do so well. I started thinking about this Oglalla thing and it freaking me out. And so I mentioned to her about how the Oglalla is going dry. And she says, oh, we have a farm in Kansas too. It's like, wow, mega farmer, right? So I guess a lot of that goes around. So she said, yeah, we have a farm in Kansas and let me tell you what the farmers are talking about in Kansas. It's not if the Oglalla is going to go dry, it's what they're going to do when it goes dry. And I don't know if that makes your knees weak, but it does for me. That freaks me out. The Oglalla will be dry. And as you can see here, it'll take 6,000 years to refill the Oglalla. So yes, it's a renewable resource. Chances are we're not going to be around to see that though. And the world is going to spend a lot differently in that 6,000 years. Because right now, that supplies a lot in agricultural aid to the whole world. We eat food from the Oglalla. Communities are supported by that. There's also other water that comes out of that for public use. It will well be within 50 years though, that it'll be dry. And that is going to be a huge change in the demographics of the central part of the United States. Because there's a thing called carrying capacity. This maybe goes way back into your education history. But a carrying capacity is what the environment will carry, right? What it can normally support. Once the Oglalla is dry, there's a lot of things that aren't going to be there anymore. Do you know where the cheapest public water is in the United States? If you want to turn on the faucet where you want to do it the most, it's in Phoenix, Arizona. Now, I'm originally from Arizona, and I know that when I was a kid, they were talking about the Salt River Project, which was Uber funded in order to get water to Phoenix so that it could support what population it had then. Well, the population is many times greater now than it was at that point. And why is it done? It's done to get people into the basin so they can be an economic source and they can create a center. Otherwise, Phoenix would have dried up a long time ago. Now, it's not a stretch of the imagination that that aquifer is also stressed. It is in fact. In fact, it is not far behind this aquifer, the artificially supported population in Phoenix. And so there's a thing that they talk about when they talk about communities in the world, and they're called marginal communities. When you, does anybody here know Daniel Winterbottom? Oh, you've got to know that name. Google Winterbottom. He teaches in Washington. He is a wild man. He is just a nut guy. I met him at a conference that I was at in New York City, City College in New York. We were in a symposium together. And I was freaking out because I had 6 UW seniors with us in New York City. And I thought, I got to be the guy that calls their mom and say, I don't know where they are, right? So the first thing I did when we got off the taxi, I went into the concierge and I said, okay, I need a map of the city. You got one? He said, yeah, I need 6 copies of it. Okay. Now I want you to circle where I don't want my people after 10 o'clock at night. Where don't they want to be after midnight? And I want these in different colors. And, oh yeah, no problem. So he did that for me. I took them, I'm sure the students threw those away immediately. But I'm thinking, how can I tell their moms that they're disappeared, right? I meet Daniel Winterbottom at this, and I knew kind of what I was getting into when I met him. He takes students to war zones, landscape architecture students, all over the world. And they go work with these marginal communities. And I know that he runs into some pretty major troubles, like down in Cartagena, and they've had some big issues. In fact, he said, yeah, his last visit, he said he was mugged at knife point, and one of his students was captured and ransomed. Holy cow, Daniel, how can you do that? I'm freaking out in New York City, and you're taking kids to war zones. He said, they're volunteers. Okay, Daniel. It's kind of cool. But they solve big problems. It's landscape architecture writ large. They're doing beautiful work. You need to Google Winterbottom. He's an amazing guy. Got his fellowship a couple of years back and certainly absolutely deserved it. Amazing person, but they do important work. But in his work, they go to these marginal communities, these groups of people that no longer, they've been displaced. Like in Cartagena, it was the drug lords that moved a lot of the farmers out. So they had nowhere to go. So they live in the edges of cities, or the margins. So where I'm going with that kind of uneasy discussion is that it's not a real stretch when we start looking at the Oglalla going dry and some of our urban centers starting to get dried out, that we could very well end up with marginal communities in America. And that's pretty serious stuff. So I think we need to consider that as we move through this. So let's see what the next slide is. Okay, more about the Oglalla and the money. That should get people's attention. So last time we went to this last spring when I went to the lobby day, I asked to speak to 2 additional House members. One was from Oklahoma and the other one was from Houston, Texas. And they were both very influential in different communities. One was NSF and the other guy was in appropriations. And I asked to speak with them specifically because I knew that they were both pretty much Tea Party individuals who didn't want to deal with any of the realities that I deal with. But I wanted to talk to them about how this reality of water scarcity is critical to all of us. And both of them, interestingly enough, come from fairly arid regions. So I thought we would have resonance there. The one guy is also a Native American, and so since I work a lot with Native Americans and grew up with Native Americans, I thought we would have a connection, and we did, and it was really valuable. But I think the political thing is going to be an issue because people can't go beyond the politics of this. And we've got to find a way to do that. And we're going to do it on every project. That's how you make that difference. When somebody realizes that they can flush their toilets with stormwater, when the price of water goes up so crazily that it will, and it will, that all of a sudden they can't drill their wells deep enough to get any more water. Now all of a sudden our clients will have water. And one of the projects I'll show you at the end is one that I did that had quadruple redundancy of stormwater management recharge on this sloping project. The final terrace was grass. And I used a grass that I discovered that you all probably know really, really well at Millennium Park, Rhizomatous tall fescue. Anybody here work with Barenbrug seed at all? That's an Illinois company. You got it. If I ever buy stock, I should buy some of that. Also Typar, and who's another good one? Danielle, who else do I need to buy? Those are some good ones. I use those guys all the time. But Barenbrug, the seed that's at Millennium Park it has rhizomes. It'll get all the great things of a fescue, but it has 6-foot deep roots. And so that final terrace, because I have 3 other recharge systems above it, is being watered from the bottom up. The only time we used the irrigation was to establish the grass in the beginning. And then I told them to keep it in there because it helps their fire insurance stay lower since they're in a pretty natural environment. But we've never had to turn it on. In fact, this project was completed the year before we had our big drought 3 years ago. They never watered that grass and it stayed emerald green all summer. Not magic. It's that systems thinking that we do. So good for you. We can do this. And that's the reason I'm here, because I want you to understand that I'm in your corner. And in fact, if you need somebody to come kick the engineers, hire me. I'll come with you. We'll go do it together. We can work together. We can do this. So, okay, so let's go to the next one. This worries me all the time. Did anybody read Steinbeck? Did anybody see the movie? Come on, what are we thinking? That Dust Bowl thing is a reality that can happen again. I drive through ag fields to go to Madison from my practice. And the first time I thought it was a mistake, but every year since it's been the way. They plow straight down the hill. No contour furrows, they go straight down the hill. And so I found a study a couple years ago about how many hundreds of tons of Wisconsin topsoil end up in the levee outside of New Orleans every year. Did we read Steinbeck? Look at that again. I mean, just the weight of that book is enough to scare you, right? Oh my gosh. This is serious stuff, and we've got to make people understand. Again, that's what we do. We are boots on the ground. We're the folks that are dealing with clients all the time and talking about this stuff. So it needs to become part of our vocabulary. And I know I say this because you're all thinking, yeah, he's that scary little old man with bumper stickers all over his car. No, I'm not. I'm not. Maybe I'm scary, but I don't have any bumper stickers on my car. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so in Wisconsin, that's where I work most, so that's the water that I'm dealing with. Waukesha was running out of potable water 3 years ago. In fact, they were at the point where they were in the benthic layer and they were getting bad water in the city wells. They couldn't go any deeper. What are they going to do? Well, they couldn't float a bond to go deeper, let's say that. But they'd run out of the water they originally had. So they discovered, almost serendipitously, that right at the edge of Waukesha was an underground river that came from one of the Great Lakes then circled back to the same Great Lake. But they had a chance to just tap into it, and somebody let the cat out of the bag and they said they were going to do it. Thank goodness somebody said something, because by tapping into that water, that violated not just community Wisconsin, but international law that protects the Great Lakes from that very thing happening. So now they've gone back to their purifying Fox River water, and they're also tapping a little bit deeper into that aquifer. Does that sound like a sustainable solution to anyone? No, it is not. They're going to run out of water again because Waukesha is still growing. So in Wisconsin, we're running out of water. The water balance is out of balance. The city where I live, when I first came from California, I relocated my practice from San Diego to Williams Bay. And I know that makes absolutely no sense in February. My wife has still not forgiven me. But luckily she's still married to me, so I don't know why. But yeah, we moved here from San Diego. And when I started doing this stuff 23 years ago in my practice, I remember one of the first meetings I had, and I was working with a municipal project, the city water manager stood up and he said to me, he said, well, you know, California boy. And that really made me mad right at the start, because I wasn't a California boy. I'm from Arizona. I lived in California, but yeah, okay. So, California boy, we don't have a water problem in Wisconsin. Well, I was at the time working on one of the things I was doing pro bono was working with the Kishwaukee Nature Conservancy. In our little town, we have I think it's a 200-acre conservancy. And it's not big, but it's okay. And at one point, they tried to farm it back in the Second World War. It didn't work because it was basically a wetland. But they put in these water monitoring wells. And in those wells, we have 1/8 of an inch recharge a year. But we have drawdown of 6 feet. Sounds like a deficit condition to me. Wisconsin. And so I'm sure that you have water resources as well. They're in the same kind of jeopardy. Because here's one of the things that I have to mention that really still kind of freaks me out. This is even freakier than some of the other stuff. Oglalla is pretty bad, but this one is one that kind of, it was a research moment. I'm looking at these hydrographs from all these different aquifers, trying to find one in America that's got a greater recharge than drawdown. I keep looking. And I found some really interesting data in a couple aquifers, and I started to see these peaks, these spikes in recharge. So part of me wants to celebrate and say, okay, this is no good anymore, the data's bad, ha, we can live, this is excellent. But then I started to do more, and I started to look into why those peaks were in there, because they were isolated experiences. And what I discovered was this. You all, since you're from this region or been in this region for a while, you probably don't remember this because you aren't as old as me. I'm old as dirt. But when I was a kid back in the 60s, I well remember the images of Gary, Indiana with no leaves on the trees and this whole thing about acid rain. You know, acid rain is killing all these trees. And that's pretty serious stuff, right? And so then they put all the reburners on this tax. It did what we needed to get the bonds funded, and they put in these reburners. But nobody talks about acid rain anymore. Well, maybe you do. Maybe you know about where there are sculptures that are being compromised by the rain. Maybe you understand that there are only so many letters that you can specify that are brass because others won't hold up in the environment anymore. I bumped into that. Maybe you have as well. Well, it's because acid rain did not go away. It just became not as powerful in certain locations, but it became more ubiquitous. It's pretty much everywhere to some degree or other now. And you're thinking, man, this guy is really bumming me out. I want to have another beer, just quiet down. I don't want to listen to this anymore. There'll be some good news. We'll get to that maybe, but you guys are the good news. So I'm looking to you for the good news, okay? So the acid rain thing didn't go away. So what happens when it rains? The water falls from the sky. We all know about wet and dry adiabatics, what makes rain happen, pressure changes and all those things. The water's coming down, and because there's a lot more hydrogen in the atmosphere now than there ever really was, it's binding to these molecules of H2O as it comes down through the air. So as the rain is falling, it's picking up more hydrogen than it would have typically in a pure air condition. When it hits the soil, where we're sequestering nitrogen, right? And hydrogen, we're getting that stuff sequestered. That's all good. Well, guess what? That rain picks up more of it, and now it becomes a dilute carbonic acid. Here's where it gets really scary. You thought that was bad. Most of us, you may remember that in most aquifers, there's a thing called an aquiclude that's on top. And that's the thing that limits the direct injection of non-potable water into the potable water in the aquifer. And some of them are differentially permeable, some of them are just a hard pan and the water has to go around it to eventually get in. But there's this aquiclude thing. And in many of the aquifers I've found, and particularly the one with the spikes showing, in most of the aquifers that I found, I've not looked at all, but most of the aquifers I've found in Illinois, and certainly in Wisconsin. Recently I was looking at some stuff in St. Louis and also in Louisiana. And they all have some interesting similarities. First off, the geology of that is it's a karst topography. We all remember karsts from way back when, the kettles and the dome stuff. Well, it's a karst, kind of a rolling topography in this aquiclude. And it's typically either made of limestone or dolomite. Those are the two major components in all of our aquifers that are in the aquiclude. When that carbonic acid hits it, it bores holes straight through it, and now there's direct injection of non-potable water into the aquifer, the potable water. That's the part that freaks me out. You can all be freaked out now. Do you have like a, oh my gosh moment? Yeah, that's one of those things. And that caused those spikes in the hydrographs. That's not recharge we want. And there's very little we can do about that. Very little. But it's a reality we have to deal with. So if you hear somebody say, oh, we've got all kinds of recharge, say you might want to check your data. So right now I've found two places in the world that have greater recharge than drawdown. One is Iceland and the other one is New Zealand. In fact, they're kind of cocky about it in Iceland. They're saying that, yeah, what's going to happen with the rising oceans and the fact that all that's going to happen, Iceland's just going to float. It's going to just elevate. That's not going to happen. So anyway, it's kind of an interesting thing to know. And so I kind of bum you out, and I'm sorry about that, but it's a reality that we've got to deal with. So this water thing is bigger than not.